Kyle Shelton. I direct the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. We are excited for this next installment in our Freight 101 webinar series, focusing on all things rail. And just as a reminder about what our thematic focus is and what that means for the year, CTS is looking across the board, across modes, and across topics in the freight area. We are putting together the Freight 101 series that is targeting thinking for folks who maybe don't work every day in freight and are trying to understand more pieces of it, or work in one mode of freight and want to learn more about the others. I know I learn every time I do one of these webinars and learn from our speakers. Our goal is really to try to highlight the centrality of our freight system across the board to the state and to the nation, to the world. So throughout the year, starting with this 101 series and then feeding into a set of other events that you'll see more from us if you subscribe to our newsletters and event calendars. You can also track it through the website that we've shared. There's going to be a lot of exciting content tied to freight. We're likely going to see some future research come out of it, and we'll highlight existing projects and past projects as well. So there's a lot of content on that Unpacking Freight page I suggest you check out. And then this 101 series has been really awesome to get us off the ground. We've had several discussions already around the state freight plan, or on maritime and aviation freight. Those videos are available. You can also quiz yourself on the right here. You see that? There are quizzes available for all three of those. You can also share those with colleagues and try to stump them about the freight system. And we will have those quizzes posted for our upcoming ones as well. And those include on April 10th, we'll focus on trucking. And then this is a rescheduled one on May 8th. It was initially scheduled for next week, but we had some conflicts that we need to navigate around. We're going to talk around urban delivery and logistics. So at the moment, that's the rest of our slate. But today, as I mentioned, we're really excited to talk about rail. And I will introduce our speakers and then throw it over to them. Today we are joined by Lydia Underdahl, who is the Executive Director of Public Affairs at BNSF Railway, and Mark Wegner, who's the CEO of Twin Cities and Western Railroad, and also the President of the Minnesota Regional Rail Association. So Lydia and Mark, thank you both for joining us again. I'm going to toss to Lydia to get us underway here, and then I'll pop back on to moderate the Q&A. And then just as a reminder for the audience, if you do have questions, the Q&A feature is how we're going to go through those, and I'll select those and ask those amongst my own questions. So at any point during the presentation, feel free to drop a question into that Q&A, and then at the end, I'll see what time we have left, and we'll go through as many of the questions as we can. So thanks again, Lydia and Mark. And Lydia, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Kyle. So like Kyle said, my name is Lydia Underdahl. I'm the Executive Director of Public Affairs for BNSF Railway, and I cover Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I'll let Mark introduce himself, and then I'll kick it off.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle, as well. It's Mark Wegner, CEO of Twin City and Western Railroad, Minnesota Valley, or Minnesota Prairie Line, Assistant Millbank and Red River Valley and Western Railroad, and then also president of the Minnesota Regional Railroads Association, which is our voice in St. Paul. And I'm a native of Brooklyn Center, Go Centaurs, and our headquarters are out in Glencoe, Minnesota.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So you'll see throughout their presentation, Mark and I are going to bounce around a little bit on covering the slides. And like Kyle said, we've made sure to leave some time for questions. And I just want to note off the bat, some of our slides are from the Association of American Railroads, or AAR, you'll see on the deck. AAR is a trade group that represents primarily the major freight railroads, those class ones in North America. And they focus on policy, research, standard setting, and technology. So just want to thank them for their data and contribution to the slide deck today. So for their presentation, we'll start with a real broad overview of the rail industry, including the different types of railroads, and then talk about the economic impact that railroads have on our state and the country. Safety, of course, is our top priority. We'll talk about that and spend a good amount of time discussing how rail is the safest way to move goods over land and how we're continually improving safety measures. And then we'll touch on sustainability and the environmental benefits of railroad, and wrap up with a look at railroads right here in Minnesota to give you that local perspective. So if you look at the presentation, here's a map of the railroads in the country. And here's a little fun fact to go with the map. The US has enough miles of freight railroads to circle the earth 5.6 times. So our freight railroads are the most productive and cost-effective in the world. They connect consumers and businesses across the country and globally, which really benefits the environment. And we are constantly promoting safety. We're crucial for shippers from nearly every sector of the U.S. economy. We move raw materials and finished goods, both domestically and internationally. In fact, freight rail accounts for about 40% of those long distance ton miles, which is more than any other mode of transportation. Next slide.
Some other fun facts. There are 6 large railroad systems in the country known as Class 1s, and there are 621 smaller railroads, short line and regional railroads in the United States. We have 135,000 route miles, 28,000 locomotives, 1.6 million rail cars. We consume 3.3 billion gallons of fuel moving freight across the nation. We have 140,000 employees, and we ship 27 million carloads and intermodal units, intermodal being a container on a rail car. Yes, we have some common characteristics. We are privately owned and we're common carriers, which common carrier means is that we're governed by the Surface Transportation Board and are obligated to haul whatever a customer asks us to haul. So we don't have a choice. That's called our common carrier obligation. The same company usually owns the track and operates trains over it. We have very little government funding. Everything we do is self-funded based on the freight revenue we earn that we can reinvest back into our infrastructure. We do have substantial federal regulation. Economically, we're governed by the Surface Transportation Board, an independent federal agency out of Washington, D.C. And then on all things safety and operations, we are governed by the Federal Railroad Administration, which is an agency under the United States Department of Transportation, but they govern all things rail safety. And they frequently come out and check on all aspects of our railroad to make sure that we're operating safely, including the signals are working properly, the track is being inspected properly, the trains are being operated properly, etc. So it is a very regulated, and it's good because it ensures that we're safe. We want to be safe. In the country, sometimes what happens in one area can impact others. So a couple of years ago, you had the severe floods in Nebraska, which impacts the rest of the system because now in order to get from Minnesota to California, you have to kind of go around Nebraska to get there while the flooding events occurred. And so that's sometimes people don't think of that, but when you have a weather impact in an area of the country, it can slow down the rail system because you have to go around it until the tracks can get put back into place. We host passenger trains such as Amtrak, but we operate very few. And then there is a broad access to the rail network, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In this broad access to the rail network, there's a thing called transloading, which in essence can mean we rail to the river and it goes from rail to barge, or vice versa, comes up the river, goes from barge to rail. Likewise in Duluth, it can go from rail to ship or ship to rail. And the most common one is bringing it in by rail and then putting it on a truck so it can get trucked to its destination, or trucking it to the railroad, putting it on a rail car so it can get railed to its destination, which also involves warehousing. And so if you are not located physically on a rail line, transloading is a way for you to be able to take advantage of the economics of shipping via rail, but the flexibility of having trucks. So that is a big growth area for the railroads, is in transloading. Large and small railroads are working together. So this is a very interesting graph. So there are 6 large railroads known as Class 1s with 91,000 miles, 122,000 employees, and the freight revenue in billions is 77.6 billion, and that's on an annual basis. The non-Class 1s, which were there over 600 of them, 621, we have almost half of the route miles as the large railroads, not quite, 44,000, and we have 19,000 employees, but you'll see our revenue is 5.4 billion. So proportionately, the economics for small railroads is greatly different than the economics for the large railroads, because of the lower density of rail cars going over the miles that short lines operate relative to class ones.
So a little bit more about those class ones. A class one railroad's defined as a railroad with an operating revenue of 490 million or more, and that's a 2023 number. It's adjusted for inflation every year. The 6 class one railroads are the largest railway carriers and account for the majority of the rail infrastructure in the country, like Mark talked about and we saw on the last slide. And then also outside of that Northeast corridor, which is a bit unique, and Mark mentioned this too, but class one railroads own the tracks that host most of Amtrak's intercity passenger rail operations and also support commuter rail operations in certain regions. And certainly that's the case in the Twin Cities. Minnesota is served by 4 class ones: BNSF Railway, Union Pacific, Canadian National, and CPKC. And you'll see CP and KCS listed separately on this chart, but CP recently acquired KCS and combined to create CPKC. Slide. So a little bit about BNSF. We're one of those class ones, one of those larger railroads, largest in Minnesota. We are one of North America's leading freight transportation companies and operate a vast rail network of 32,500 route miles across 28 states and 3 Canadian provinces. You can see on the map here that we're a West Coast railroad. So we run from about Chicago, New Orleans west. We're a Berkshire Hathaway company, wholly owned, with about 37,000 employees and a fleet of about 7,500 locomotives. We operate an average of 1,200 trains per day. Again, most of those are those long hauls, like Mark talked about. We're a transporter of the products and materials that help feed, clothe, supply, power communities throughout America and the world. We have the largest and fastest intermodal network in the United States, in large part meaning those consumer products we love to buy at our favorite stores or order from Amazon. We also handle more agricultural product shipments than any other U.S. railroad. So to help kind of put some of that into perspective, here are some fun facts. In 2023 alone, we transported 4.5 million intermodal shipments. And those are truck trailers or containers and shipments that were on our rail instead of on the nation's congested highways. During the holiday season, we moved 85 million packages. So there is a good chance some of your holiday gifts were on a BNSF train at some point. We move about 3 million brand new cars and trucks per year, which averages to about 5 per minute. We transport enough grain each year to supply 700 million people with a year's worth of bread. And we move enough lumber annually to frame 300,000 houses.
There are, as we mentioned, there's more than 620 short line railroads. And as you can see by this variety of logos, each short line kind of has its own little personality, depending on the region it operates in and whether it's part of a holding group of several short lines or independent. But we do have an association in Washington, D.C. called the American Short Line and Regional Railroads Association, which, like the Association of American Railroads, advocates for things on the federal level. Next. The Twin City and Western Railroad, like many of the short lines in Minnesota, was once a class 1, but through the passage of time, the Milwaukee Road was the railroad that TCW now is. The Milwaukee Road went bankrupt. The Sioux Line, now CPKC, acquired the Milwaukee Road, and they started spinning off pieces of their system that were lighter density, and the Twin City and Western was one. And so it was formed in 1991. It operates 220 route miles from St. Paul, Minnesota out to Millbank, South Dakota. And it interchanges in St. Paul with BNSF, CN, CPKC, and UP. And then also BNSF at Appleton, Minnesota. The Minnesota Prairie Line is actually 94 miles owned by the Minnesota Valley Regional Rail Authority, which was formed in 1980 to prevent the Chicago Northwestern, now UP, line from getting abandoned. And in 2002, we partnered with them to start operating it for them because prior to that, it was in such terrible shape. It was known as the line of the standing derailment. And I'm pleased to say, since 2002, we have grown rail carloads from that line from 2000 in 2003 to over 8,000 this last year. So it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's growing the economies of central Minnesota, which is kind of the role we see ourselves as we facilitate economic development in the rural areas that we serve. So this is the railroads. We have 223 billion in economic output. One job in the rail sector supports nearly 4 others. 750,000 jobs, 71 billion in wages. For every dollar invested in rail infrastructure, we drive $2.50 in economic activity. And so we directly employ 153,000 workers, but our total employment impact is far greater, supporting 749,000 jobs nationwide through supply chains and consumer spending.
And
And I'll let
talking a
Lydia-
little,
Yep.
sorry, Mark, talking a little bit more about those jobs, we can stay on the slide, thanks. The industry is really has great, strong wage and benefit packages, like you see on the screen, over $70 billion in wages that, you know, contribute to the economy of the communities where our employees live, work, and play. So if you think back to that first map of the rail network, that's an awful lot of people living in a lot of communities throughout America and a lot of rural America. Every transportation job supports 3.9 additional jobs across the nation and the economy. And our freight rail employees are highly skilled professionals. They're among some of the best compensated workers in the nation. Our Class 1 railroad employees' annual pay and benefit package is valued from $135,000 to almost $190,000. And just for context, that's about 40% more than the national average. It's also a very low barrier to entry. So we hire from all educational experiences and backgrounds, ranging from high school graduates to those with advanced degrees for a wide range of jobs. And many railroaders stay in their careers for decades. So the median tenure of a railroad employee is 13 years. Again, just for context, that's compared to about 3.9 years for other private sector workers. So we're always promoting safety. The freight rail industry is one of the safest industries to work in the nation. It's even safer than grocery stores if you look at data for injuries per hours worked. Also, can't talk about our employees without talking about veterans. Railroads actively hire veterans. About 1 in 6 rail employees are veterans. So like Mark said, you know, we're the backbone of the U.S. economy, and certainly our employees are a vital part of that.
And with freight demand set to rise by 27% by 2040, and this is overall freight demand, railroads invest about $23 billion annually just to maintain their high capacity network that drives economic growth. As we look toward the future, a strong rail industry is essential to keeping the United States competitive, resilient, and vibrant, a key pillar in America's economic success. Next. So this is a graphic of what Lydia says, but what I want to say is people usually don't notice trains unless either you're stopped at a rail crossing waiting for a train or you read about a derailment. Well, let's talk about if you get stopped by a train at a crossing. Now, if there's a coal car, there's enough coal in one rail car that can heat 19 homes for a year. If you have a covered hopper car, it has enough corn in that car to feed 37,000 chickens for life. If there's a carload of ammonia, that's enough in one carload to fertilize 770 acres of corn. As Lydia mentioned, enough grain for 258,000 loaves of bread. And on a lumber carload, that's enough lumber for 5.5 homes. And for those hauling oil, one rail car can produce 13,500 gallons of gasoline from the crude oil. There are cost savings with rail. The rail industry was partially deregulated in 1980. which meant that railroads prior to that, they were handcuffed on how they could price things. And so they couldn't adjust to market factors. And so that led to the large decline. Well, that shackle was loosened in 1980. It didn't go away, but it was loosened. And as a result of that, railroads started lowering their prices so that they could attract more businesses, which is what they needed to do. And so consequently, even today, as of 2022, the average rail rates are 40% lower today than in 1980. And I don't know where else you could say that something costs less than it did, 45 years ago. So it's a very good news story. Next. Now we're going into the future. Railroads, unfortunately, aren't like Amazon, where you can take your phone and say, where's my rail car right now? We recognize that it's a complex challenge, but we are definitely doing all kinds of things to get to a place where visibility on the railroad to a shipper securely will happen. So things like GPS and putting sensors on rail cars so that we can track them, and smart dispatching software, things like that. As I told Lydia before we got on this thing, I think freight railroads can be the most archaic of technology. We go back to hauling rail 1825, yet we can be the most modern of technology. Every locomotive, believe it or not, is a hybrid. You have a diesel engine powering electric motors to move that, and those have been around since the 1930s. So we were like the original hybrid powered land vehicle. Next. So the United States is huge in international trade, both in exporting. A lot of our agriculture products in Minnesota get exported, and BNSF has a wonderful pipeline to Seattle, Tacoma. And so it keeps Minnesota's farmers competitive in getting their goods for export. 38% of all rail traffic is directly tied to trade-related shipments. 543.5 million tons of goods move through United States ports and across the borders via rail. 29.8 billion in rail revenue, which is 37% of the Class 1 railroad earnings, came from trade-related shipments. So the elephant in the room is, well, what's all this tariff talk going to do? Well, we are all keeping an eye on it. It will impact it in some way, shape, or form, but people need to eat and people consume things. And so I think, railroads, we stand at the ready to adjust however this is going to play out. Next.
Thanks, Mark. So moving on to safety, railroads are dedicated to keeping our employees and the communities along our routes safe. We are the safest way to move goods over land, and we're constantly working to get, even safer. The Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA, just recently released its full 2024 data. So we have these numbers hot off the presses, and it confirms what we've been saying, which is, rail continues to get safer. We saw some record low injury and accident rates last year. The FRA data for 2024 shows us that the overall train accident rate has declined 33% since 2005 and 15% just year over year. Derailment rates have improved 40% since 2005, and that's marking 2024 as the second lowest year on record. And then mainline accident rates have fallen 37% since 2005, with Class 1 rates improving by 43%. Employee safety remains a top priority, and the industry is making notable progress in that category as well. The injury and fatality rate industry-wide has dropped 27% since 2005, and Class 1 railroads have seen a 46% reduction, with 2024 setting another all-time low. In hazardous material transportation, the industry continues to excel. Of over 99.99% of shipments arrive safely, and the hazardous material accident rate has declined 80% since 2005. All of that said, our work never stops on safety. At BNSF, our vision is to operate free of accidents and injuries, and every day we work to make that vision a reality through safety programs, training, and technology. Our approach to safely transporting hazardous materials is threefold. One, we prevent incidents through our robust track and equipment inspections. We have employee training and compliance programs, and our annual capital investments and maintenance to ensure that railroads remain in the best condition that it's ever been. We then mitigate the risk of an incident by partnering with our customers to use the safest tank cars built to the most stringent standards. And finally, we respond effectively. So we ensure that we and the communities we serve are prepared to respond in the rare instance of an incident. And we'll go into depth on those pieces a little bit more. Next, please. So keeping our network in top shape with private investments is a big part of prevention. A well-maintained network is, of course, critical for safety. And Mark touched on this earlier, but most of America's freight railroads handle their own infrastructure, from building and maintaining to operating and funding, and really with little or no help from the government. And that really sets us apart from other modes. Every year, freight rail companies pour $23 billion into improving and modernizing our networks. In 2023 alone, Class 1 railroads invested $26.8 billion to upgrade infrastructure, boost safety, and enhance reliability. Just for context, that's roughly 6 times what the average US manufacturer invests. And of course, these investments don't just make things safer, they also fuel economic growth. For every dollar spent on rail transportation, about $2.50 is generated in economic activity. Specific to just BNSF, we plan to spend around $3.8 billion in 2025 on our capital expenditure program, and that brings our total over the past decade to $35 billion. Again, that's the billion with a B, so these are good big numbers. Next. Another piece of that private investment that helps enhance safety is investments and upgrades in our equipment. So that includes locomotives and rail cars. If you think of investing in our tracks in the ground, like maintaining a safe and well-kept roads, this part is about ensuring the vehicles on the road, or for us, our locomotives and rail cars, are also in good condition. So these cars are privately owned. The locomotives are ours, the railroads, but the cars are either owned by the railroad or the customer. We have all sorts of different types of cars: box cars, hopper cars, flat cars, auto racks, center beams, and tank cars, just to name a handful. And investing in all of that equipment is a big part of our safety program. Tank cars specifically, I'll talk about just because they have changed drastically in the last decade. And that's that mitigation piece that I covered. So just to reiterate, today, more than 99.99% of rail hazmat shipments arrive safely at their destination without incident. And hazardous material incidents have declined 80% since 2005. But in the extremely unlikely chance of hazmat shipments involved in an incident, new tank car standards were put in place to mitigate or minimize the risk by ensuring that those cars are really constructed to the highest standards. So they're essentially designed to prevent the release of hazardous materials. The new standards ensure that tank cars are built with better thermal protection, higher grade steel, and better valves and fittings. And there's more information on that slide on those points. Unlike other cars that I mentioned, railroads don't own these. These tank cars are owned by the customer. At BNSF, we've incentivized our customers to move to that higher tank car standard, the DOT 117s they're called, ahead of what's federally regulated. And then my last note on the tank cars is they're not always carrying hazardous material. If you look for a hazmat placard, it's usually red, then there's hazardous material in that tank car. But a lot of the time they're carrying other material that just simply transports better in a tank car. And often it's corn syrup. Next, thank you. So I talked about the investments we're making in our infrastructure to ensure safety. We're also making investments in technology to enhance safety and, of course, try to prevent these incidents before they happen. Along with our employees, technology plays a critical role in our safety program, especially when it comes to inspecting our tracks, bridges, locomotives, and rail cars. And because a big part of operating safely is making sure accidents don't happen in the first place, we utilize the latest technology on and alongside our tracks. Next. So I'm going to flip into BNSF mode because every railroad's doing something a little bit different. And I'm excited to share some of the new stuff we're working on in the technology space. Next. You can't talk about technology without talking about data. So data is exploding worldwide. Over 400 million terabytes of data are created each day. And since 2010, it's really skyrocketed with about 90% of the world's data being created in just the last 2 years. So AI and ChatGPT and all those fun things coming online, it's really increasing the data. Next. What does that mean for BNSF? Well, here's what some examples of what exploding data looks like for us. 10 years ago, we were inspecting 70,000 miles of track each year. Now, using technology like onboard sensors, machine vision, we can inspect 500,000 miles a year. We also have 4,000 trackside detectors that are doing 35 million readings each day, using thermal, acoustic, visual, and force sensors to assess the health of our rail cars and locomotives. We have 13 drones flying 50 flights a day at our facilities, collecting 60,000 frames of video each day. And then my final example is we have dispatching teams that are using something called Movement Planner to line more than 8 million signals across our network every day. And a lot of these data points have ties back to enhancements that we've made in safety and efficiency, and those safety wins that we talked about with some of the data that was just released by the FRA. So I'll talk first about positive train control. PTC is intended to prevent train-to-train collisions, derailments caused by excessive speed, and having the train preventing the train from entering a piece of the track that it shouldn't be, like if workers are working on the track or if a train went through a misaligned switch on accident. PTC is highly complex. It uses 3 main elements. It has an onboard locomotive system, which monitors the speed and position, and it can brake the train if needed. A wayside system, which monitors track signals, switches, and then communicates back to the locomotive. And then the back office server, which stores information relating to the train in the network and transmits authorization for trains to move from segment of track to the next segment of track. And then all of that syncs up through integrated wireless communication system. So BNSF was the first to complete installation, and we continue to expand beyond what's federally mandated on our railroad. And just for context too, on the amount of PTC that's on the network, about 90% of our freight moves on these PTC routes. I mentioned earlier that we inspect more than 500,000 miles of track in 2023. This distance is equivalent to circling the Earth over 20 times. We have 6 retrofitted passenger cars that are equipped with onboard sensors and computers, and they travel the system 24/7 and are constantly collecting data and inspecting our track. But we wanted to not stop there, we want to extend our ability to cover more track more frequently. So we designed and built a locomotive-based track geometry system. So these will go right onto our locomotives that are otherwise hauling our normal freight. And we call that ODIN, for Onboard Defect and Notification System. And that's going to go onto 65 of our locomotives. And these use angled lasers on each side of the box to measure the gauge and cross-level alignment profile of the rail. So we know everything's in the place that it should be. And then measurements are taken about every foot and processed in real time. So if a defect is found, we're able to take action quickly to correct the issue. This new technology will increase our annual inspection miles to 5 million. Again, 10 years ago, we were inspecting 70,000. I also mentioned the 4,000 trackside detectors collecting rail car and locomotive data around the clock. These equipment detectors take 35 million readings every day. We have 12 different types of technology that are feeding into those readings, like temperature, acoustic, sonic, and machine vision systems to detect defects in equipment in motion over 70 miles an hour, day or night, rain, snow, or shine. And then we have algorithms that crunch those 35 million readings to spot issues fast and make maintenance more accurate and efficient. And I'll walk through some examples because I think it's easier to see pictures. So the examples I'll show you just focus on how we monitor our wheels. Just for example, wheel health is very important, and we monitor it in a variety of ways. So one example on the top there is our acoustic bearing detector. That listens for specific bearing component defects to ensure any unusual sounds are caught early. So we know kind of exactly how a wheel should sound. And if that wheel starts sounding different than how it should, that could mean there is a defect and that needs to be looked at. The hot box detector that's in the middle there monitors the temperature of the bearings and can help us identify statistical outliers and potential brake issues or burned off journals. We know the right temperature for the wheel, and if the wheel gets too hot, it might mean there's a problem. And that detector will alarm if the wheel reaches a certain high temperature threshold. But even if it doesn't get that hot, what we can do is look at trends across a series of detectors and across all equipment on the train. So if we have multiple sensors and between sensor 1 and sensor 2, we're showing that a temperature is increasing at a rate that we know is not normal, that will also alert us, even if it hasn't reached that kind of high absolute temperature threshold. So again, the goal here is to identify issues well before there's a problem. We also have on the bottom here, brake health effectiveness system, which checks for cold wheels. When a brake is applied, the wheel should heat up to a certain degree. If you think of a brake applying against a wheel, there's friction and that should create heat. If there's no heat, it's likely that that brake's not working how it should. And that thermal photo on the bottom with red is an example of that wheel heat from an applied brake. My last example is the wheel tread inspection detector, which uses cameras to visually inspect the entire wheel plate and tread surface. And that can identify for us cracks, breaks, missing pieces, just to ensure that everything's in top condition. So if you imagine a train going at normal speed across the track, obviously a human standing on the side of the track would not be able to provide this level of detail, including finding things like hairline fractures, for example. The photo on the screen is a picture of a train going normal speed, and this is just one of those 35 million pieces of data per day that we get from the detectors. So, it's 35 million chances per day to keep things safe. And all of this data is where AI comes in. So with all the data that we're collecting from our detectors, like the 35 million daily readings, AI can really step in to transform it into action. So we're boosting safety, asset utilization, service, and operational efficiency. And we're using it to refine business practices and processes, enhance efficiency, and ultimately the goal is to improve safety and service. From a safety perspective, thanks to the wayside detectors and sensors on our locomotives and other systems like I've talked about, well, we now have this vast troves of data that AI can then analyze and predict potential defects in cars, locomotives, or rail before they happen, before they're a problem, and that helps us prevent major failures. This technology certainly can help us standardize our processes, but we still rely on our subject matter experts, our humans, to bring their expertise and guide those business decisions. We find that with this technology, our humans, our employees are not just spotting issues. AI really helps turn our team from finders into fixers. So they're constantly working to prevent problems before they grow. And those 35 million readings a day, alongside with data from our other sources, that's where we continue to see big opportunity to continuously improve safety, service, and capacity. We talked about preventing incidents from happening in the first place, and then how we mitigate by using those safest tank cars. But here's a little bit about how we respond effectively if an incident does happen. While 99.99% of our hazardous material shipments arrive without incident, we still prepare for the rare chance of a spill. And our railroad teams up with governments and local responders to train tens of thousands of emergency responders every year. We have extensive training programs and collaborations. We make sure that our emergency responders along our network have the resources and information they need to handle hazmat incidents effectively. We also partnered with the International Association of Fire Chiefs to create an Ask Rail app. And this app gives first responders timely data about the type of hazmat that a rail car is carrying, which helps them just make informed decisions on the scene of a rail emergency. Today, more than 2.3 million first responders have access to that Ask Rail app. We also maintain 24/7 hazmat teams. We have our own emergency experts and hotlines at just BNSF alone. So we're just one of the class ones. We've trained over 140 hazmat. We have over 140 hazmat responders at 60 locations across our network. And then we also have pre-positioned response equipment. So it's located on our network, depending on what else we have, what we're hauling along that part of the network. And we're supported by a network of contract emergency and environmental responders. So we have our external contractors also who are strategically placed along the network. And we collaborate with industry and government partners here in Minnesota, but of course our federal partners too, the FRA, PHMSA, TSA, and FEMA to strengthen emergency response efforts.
And we, as a short line, we also participate in this. We do hazmat drills every year, and we also partner with our local fire and emergency response communities to train as well. Beyond hazmat trainings, we are also very community minded. Basically, if you look at a map, most communities were formed around a railroad. The railroad may no longer be there, but for the railroads that remain, the railroad was kind of like the centerpiece of town. Well, what that does as the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area continues to grow, new developments occur out in the suburbs, exurbs, and a lot of times these housing developments are placed in a piece of land right next to the freight railroad, which then can create community issues when these new people move out there and all of a sudden realize, oh, there's a railroad there. Oh, it's making noise. And so we like to communicate with our local communities to get us involved with these development things as before they become reality, so that we can ask the developer to, put some kind of mitigation in their development so we can prevent these issues from going forward. And the same issue is occurring in the inner cities where warehouses are being converted to housing units. And most of these warehouses, or a lot of them, were rail served back in the day, and the rail might still be there. Well, now these residents are living in what used to be a warehouse, and they too have issues with train noise. And so we want to make sure that when these developments are occurring, that you keep the railroads in mind and communicate that to the people that are developing these things. We are very safety functioned. Grade crossings are where vehicle traffic and rails meet. We're constantly trying to educate the public on being safe around rail crossings. And then also there are trespassing issues with people walking along a railroad. So people are not allowed to walk along freeways, and they should consider a railroad like a freeway and don't walk along it, because there have been unfortunate fatalities where a person with headphones walking along a railroad track didn't hear the train and couldn't hear the train, and unfortunately they're no longer with us. So we're very much trying to prevent tragedies from occurring. The other thing we should note about railroads in local communities, railroads pay property taxes because we own the property, and the property taxes are the valuation is created by the state, and then the state lays out by county which parcels apply the property taxes. But our property taxes are used by the local communities, the local school districts, and the counties that we go through. So in addition to the payroll taxes and income taxes we also pay property taxes. And then we also do community giving. I know BNSF Foundation is a big one that gives to communities. Shoreline railroads, without that robust revenue, we typically contribute to our local fire emergency response efforts. Next. So let's talk about the environment. Railroads are the most greenhouse gas friendly form of land transportation. In 2023, railroads moved a ton of freight, an average of 488 miles per gallon of fuel. And I always like to put it this way. If you were a 2.5 ton automobile, that would be the equivalent of like 125 miles to the gallon. So that's kind of goes to show you how fuel efficient we are. Another thing, railroads handle 40% of the nation's long distance freight volume, yet we only account for 0.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And in the transportation related sources, we only contribute 1.7%. So we are already very, very environmentally friendly. We play an important role on reducing highway congestion by taking long haul freight trucks off the road. One long double stack intermodal train can replace hundreds of freight trucks, thus easing congestion for motorists on overburdened highways and related idle time. And if 25% of truck traffic moving at least 750 miles went by rail instead, annual greenhouse gas emissions would fall by 13.6 million tons. Next.
And at BNSF, we're going, beyond helping to reduce our customers' carbon emissions through the efficiencies like Mark talked about. We're also leading the way when it comes to sustainable practices of our own. So we're partnering in developing the next generation of locomotives, testing new technologies that will further reduce carbon emissions, and testing biodiesel and renewable diesel for use in our locomotives.
Okay, next slide. After this, yeah, this one shows, this is the map that shows the large railroads and the small railroads in Minnesota. So these are the active freight rail lines in Minnesota. I know we're pressing short on time. I would just like to call out a couple of programs. The short line railroads, as I mentioned, with the Minnesota Valley Regional Rail Authority, a lot of them were left in terrible condition, and they still are. A lot of these short lines in Minnesota operate at 10 mile an hour. And so there's a federal program called the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Fund that we've been able to tap into to start improving our railroad to the point where you can handle the heavier rail cars and replace century-old rails. And then on the state level, there's the Minnesota Rail Service Improvement Fund, which is basically a fund that the legislature funds and at different levels, and we're constantly trying to educate our elected officials on that. Last slide. These are the railroads that are in Minnesota. The top four are the large railroads, and the remainder are the regional ones. And with that, as you can see, we're enthusiastic about our industry and the wonderful benefits it has, but we're running out of time, so we better let it open up for Q&A.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Lydia. That's so much great content. Lydia, next time that the retrofitted passenger car comes through Minneapolis, I want to go visit it. That sounds pretty amazing to see those all going. So thank you so much for sharing so much about all the work you guys are doing and all the work in Minnesota and across the country. We have a good couple questions. Others can put them in. You may have to follow up with us and maybe see if we can get some questions answered for you, but want to cut through some, or want to jump to some of these here for our last few minutes. There's a couple good questions here around, you guys mentioned private infrastructure investments. A good question around how funding works and how coordination works when you're doing like a bridge or a tunnel or a crossing. Are the railroads sort of solely responsible for those costs, or how do you share those costs and the planning with local, state, and federal entities?
You want that one, Lydia, or shall I take it?
Either way.
I can take it because I know on Twin City Western, so there is a Section 130 federal funds, which is dedicated to rail road crossings. And so Minnesota, along with the other 48 states that rail runs through, Hawaii being the only one that doesn't, gets this Section 30 money. And then the Minnesota DOT keeps a running list of railroad crossings that will need to be upgraded or add signals added and so on and so forth. And so you got to kind of get on their list. And then depending on the federal allocation, it's usually 95% funded on federal level and 5% railroad funded, or 100% federally funded. In this last round, it is now 100% federally funded. But you have to work with MnDOT to get on their list, because MnDOT's the one that administers it.
And just to back up a little bit on that question, if you think of it, like Mark talked about, the railroad's been there a long time. A lot of these cities that built up around the railroad exist because it was a railroad stop. So what we're really talking about when we're talking about a crossing is the public accessing our property. So a rail crossing is not for the benefit of a railroad. In fact, the safest crossings, a closed crossing. We would love to have those crossings closed if the communities are willing, or create an overpass or underpass. So when we're talking about, the railroad contribution to the crossing, that 5% that Mark talked about, that's really us helping assist just a small amount in that cost, but really it's the public use of that crossing that is being discussed and funded. So does fall on the public, whether it's state or federal.
Thanks, y'all. Another question, you both mentioned your workforce and the importance of those individual employees and the collective there. A question about sort of how you all are thinking, and in many of those cases, they're physically demanding, challenging to people's day-to-day, being on call, moving around. Can you talk a little bit about how railroad industry and companies are thinking about preventing burnout and how you think about retention, recruitment, and those types of jobs?
Would say listen to your employees. We listen to them all the time. We know that there's generational change coming with the new generation, but constantly kind of adjusting things to address quality of life issues and things of that nature. But it all starts with listening to your employees.
Certainly, and from our perspective, we are, I think, 80 to 90%, depending on the railroad, union employees. So we're having constant conversations and collectively bargaining with our unions on, what they need. And certainly that's evolved, like Mark talked about. I just go back to the point I made that the median tenure of a railroad employee is 13 years. So we like that. We're proud of that. There's generations of employees that continue to work for the railroad through generations, and we love that and want to keep that going. So we want to keep our employees happy and engaged and retained.
Thanks. I had a question about, talking about the theme and the 101 series we're doing here, and you guys both touched on this in terms of intermodal hubs, and I think just the way you were responding to the idea of the coordinated projects. I'm just curious, what are some of the more complex elements of those interactions with other modes? I mean, I know you talked about transloading, and we have the intermodal hubs, like whether it be policy or literally just like the physics of the trucks and the trains coming together. What are some of the big kind of hairy problems you guys think through day to day when you're interacting with those other modes?
Idea?
Yeah, I would say, I think we're all striving as a freight network to just continue to remain efficient and get even more efficient, and build our capacity without maybe being able to build our physical footprint. So how can we, move more trains without having to buy more property? Because that's not always an option. We've seen industrial property, particularly in large cities, dwindle as zoning plans have changed. So how can we continue to grow capacity to allow for, more intermodal facilities or more ability to grow customer sites when some of that property is maybe not as readily available? But certainly from an intermodal perspective and multimodal perspective, we're always striving to be efficient between modes, and think a healthy freight network is best for all of us.
I'll give you a small example of TCW. We partnered with a manufacturer in Rosemont, which is nowhere near our rail line, to bring in recycled aluminum from Boeing in Washington State via BNSF, and then they hand it off to us. We bring it to Eden Prairie, where it's taken from the rail car and put into a truck, and then the truck brings it down to Rosemont. And so that's one small example of coordinating between the modes.
Thanks, Mark. That's a great example. Wonderful. Well, we are coming right up to the 1 o'clock hour here, and we want to give people some transition time to their next meetings and finishing up lunch. And Mark and Lydia may be getting to eat lunch here if you haven't already. But I just want to say thank you to both of you again. For those of you online, again, thanks for joining us. The video from today will be posted to the Unpacking Freight page, and we'll get the presentations up as well. And we always welcome feedback, other questions. We can do our best to connect you all with Mark and Lydia and others if you have follow-up questions, or CTS can always try to answer them as well. And keep an eye out for the freight rail quiz and see how well you do. I did admit that I did better on aviation than I did on our state freight plan quiz, so you can really just keep testing yourself on all of them. So Mark, Lydia, thank you again, and thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you on the future webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you.